Speaking out about the culture on campus, Fox 2's Jessica Dupnick gives us the details.
50 years later, I'm still carrying this anger.
Robert Stone, the first to publicly come forward in 2020, accusing disgraced University of Michigan doctor Robert Anderson of sexual assault. He died in 2008. The details too vile and perverse for TV.
This is a Dr. Frankenstein. And these are the kinds of things that went on that you don't know about because the university would not commit to transparency.
Stone and another survivor, Keith Murray, spoke out via teleconference Tuesday against the university and its regents' continued mishandling of Dr. Anderson's abuse that went on for decades against athletes and gay men.
I likely was abused because I just come out to Dr. Anderson as a gay man.
This days after the university president, Mark Schlissel, who is married, was fired for an affair with a subordinate.
My overall reaction to the entire episode can be encapsulated in 3 words. What a pig.
So far, hundreds of men have come out against Anderson. It prompted U of M to hire Washington, D.C.-based law firm Wilmer Hale, which found
dozens of University of Michigan employees were alerted through the decades to the actions of Robert Anderson.
And that when survivors like Morey reported Anderson to university higher-ups, Anderson kept practicing.
Of course, we now know how this played out. Robert Anderson was never removed from his medical oversight of students, and in fact, was shuffled to a position with even more power and control over students.
A statement from U of M says in part, the university is going to extraordinary measures to put critical protections in place on top of earlier protections. We continue to work with the nationally recognized consulting firm of Guidepost Solutions on additional measures. Reporting in Ann Arbor, Jessica Dupnick, Fox 2 News.
Experiences with Anderson when he was a doctor for the University Health Services. They say they were sexually abused in the 70s and 80s, and the school failed them. Keith Murray was in the class of 1981, Robert Stone, class of 1972. They want to bring attention to the fact that Anderson's victims were not all university wrestlers and football players. Murray says he was sexually abused back then and reported that abuse back in 1981 and was promised by an assistant vice president for student services that Anderson would be removed. That never happened.
After that agreement with Mr. Easthope, all of the sexual abuse that Robert Anderson committed was especially unnecessary, preventable, tragic, and did not have to happen.
Dr. Anderson was a troll. He was just a disgusting human being. And what he put us through was so traumatizing. I remembered when I walked out of that exam room, I was so disgusted and I was so angry. And I'm still angry. 50 years later, I'm still carrying this anger.
Well, Stone blames tenure rules for Anderson not being fired, and he wants to see changes. Stay with 7 Action News and WXYZ.com for much more on this developing story.
Schlissel was being accused of. But they're sort of along the same continuum of what happens when people are made untouchable.
Murray hopes interim president Mary Sue Coleman brings reforms, but Robert Stone, another survivor of Anderson's abuse, has doubts. He notes that Coleman led the school for a decade until 2014.
For the university to reach back and rehire a 78-year-old fossil from the last decade who sat in that chair for all of those years and instituted none of the changes that are necessary at the University of Michigan, I would say I am not optimistic, and that's an understatement.
Anderson worked at the university until 2003 and died in 2008. I am Sarah Lear.
And so damaged that they can't talk about them.
Robert Stone was the first to come out against Dr. Robert Anderson nearly 2 years ago. He, like dozens since, claims Anderson sexually abused him. Many of Anderson's survivors were athletes. Others, like Stone and Keith Morey, were gay students.
Robert Anderson was a chronic serial sexual predator who exploited any power differential he could find. Many of Anderson's earliest victims at the University of Michigan were gay men, at a time when being outed could have grave consequences.
They say they are still just the tip of the iceberg.
So many people have come forward and told their stories, but many people have not. I know of people who still have not spoken out because of shame, embarrassment.
And that shame and embarrassment will keep people from speaking up. The university has yet to do anything about it. And with the recent scandal and termination of the university's president, Stone and Morey are increasing their pleas.
It's transparently clear to anyone who wants to pay attention that there's no commitment to change, because the president of the university couldn't stop himself from having his own affair that was against their written rules.
A new president could bring a new insight and new compassion these alums are seeking.
I think this is an opportunity for the university to really do the right thing.
Eric Lloyd, 9 and 10 News.
School is going to bring about change. Keith Moore and Robert Stone say the school is ready for a culture change at the university's board as the university's board looks for a new president. The board, as you know, removed U of M President Mark Schlissel just this week due to an alleged inappropriate relationship with a university employee. The two men say they hope that firing will let the school be more accountable towards abuse victims. They say former university Dr. Robert Anderson abused them decades ago.
More information. Two men who say they were sexually assaulted by a former University of Michigan sports doctor are reacting to the firing of the university's president. Keith Morey and Robert Stone say they hope a change in leadership will allow the school to be more accountable towards abuse victims. Over the weekend, President Mark Schlissel was removed for claims he had an inappropriate relationship with a university employee. Morey and Stone say the school has tarnished Michigan's reputation.
The university needs to do a hard reset on this whole culture, and it needs to be from the top down and also from the bottom up.
Right now, the university is in mediation to resolve lawsuits by more than 800 people, mostly men, who say Dr. Robert Anderson sexually abused them during routine medical exams.
Leadership means more accountability from the school. Starting in the late 60s up until the early 2000s, hundreds of U of M students accused Dr. Robert Anderson of sexually abusing them. Today, U of M graduates Robert Stone and Keith Morey spoke out. Stone claims Anderson sexually assaulted him during a medical exam in the early 70s. Then, in the early 80s, Morey directly reported the abuse from Anderson to authorities and was promised reportedly by school officials that Anderson would be fired, but was then shocked when he remained in his position.
We now know how this played out. Robert Anderson was never removed from his medical oversight of students, and in fact was shuffled to a position with even more power and control over students.
Despite their frustrations, the two men hope after the weekend firing of President Mark Schlissel, the school will take more accountability for its lack of action towards sexual abuse victims.
In Emmett County, an explosion.
Hoping that, that a change in leadership will allow the school to be more accountable toward abuse victims. Over the weekend, Mark Schlissel was removed due to an alleged inappropriate relationship with a university employee. Keith Morey and Robert Stone say the school is ripe for a culture change as its board conducts a search for a permanent replacement. They say decades of sexual abuse by Dr. Robert Anderson have tarnished Michigan's reputation.
Voting rights take center stage on
And two men who say they were sexually assaulted by a former sports doctor at the University of Michigan are hoping that a change in leadership will allow the school to be more accountable towards abuse victims. Keith Morey and Robert Stone told reporters Tuesday that the Ann Arbor school is ripe for a culture change as its board conducts a search to permanently replace President Mark Schlissel, who was removed due to an alleged inappropriate relationship with a university employee.
Especially where it comes to anything that could shed a potentially bad light on the university. There's this kind of image of the U of M, which it's a great school. We know that. And at the same time, it's a human institution. It messes up sometimes. And I want the university to take this opportunity to really look at this situation and to move forward in ways that have been very clearly delineated.
They say Schlissel's abrupt firing and the revelations and litigation over decades of sexual abuse by Dr. Robert Anderson have tarnished the university's reputation. And as the state and the nation...
Eric Jones, who retired last Friday.
Two men who say they were sexually assaulted by former sports doctor Robert Anderson at the University of Michigan are speaking out after the firing of President Mark Schlissel. Robert Stone, who spoke live today with Keith Morey, says that he's seen no commitment to change from the university.
It is a culture of duplicity and a dual standard. One thing applies to everybody else, and those who are tenured have another set of rules, regardless of what the written procedures may be.
Schlissel was fired over the weekend due to an alleged inappropriate relationship with a subordinate. The university's Board of Regents is conducting a search for his permanent replacement.
There could as commissioner last Friday.
Two men who say that they were sexually assaulted by former sports doctor Robert Anderson at the University of Michigan are hoping that a change in leadership will allow the school to be more accountable toward abuse victims. Keith Morey, along with Robert Stone, say that the school is in need of a culture change.
I think in some ways there needs to be a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to really, first of all, look at what's been going on there. Let's get this out in the open, really know what we're dealing with, take the hard knocks, and then move forward together. And that's going to be a president with a lot of skill in terms of working with people and listening.
A board is conducting a search to permanently replace Mark Schlissel, who was removed over the weekend due to an alleged inappropriate relationship with a university employee. The men who say they were sexually assaulted by former sports doctor Robert Anderson at the University of Michigan are hoping that a change in leadership will allow the school to be more accountable toward abuse victims. Keith Morey, along with Robert Stone, says the school is in need of a culture change.
I think in some ways there needs to be a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to really, first of all, look at what's been going on there. Let's get this out in the open, really know what we're dealing with, take the hard knocks, and then move forward together. And that's going to be a president with a lot of skill in terms of working with people and listening.
A board is conducting a search to permanently replace Mark Schlissel, who was removed over the weekend because of an alleged inappropriate relationship with a university employee.
I was so disgusted and I was so angry, and I'm still angry. 50 years later, I'm still carrying this anger.
Robert Stone blames tenure rules for Anderson not being fired and wants to see charges.
The university has investigated and published its findings, but it hasn't responded to various news stories on the topic, while the school is still in legal talks with survivors. So be sure to stay with 7 Action News and WXYZ.com for much more on this story ahead.
Other top story here at 5 days after Mark Schlissel's firing as the president of the University of Michigan, the victims of Dr. Robert Anderson are calling for his replacement to make major changes.
They're calling for a more open environment at the school to help change what they've called a culture of silence. Priya Mann spoke with them today.
Days after U of M president Dr. Mark Schlissel was fired for an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate, victims of Dr. Robert Anderson say it speaks to the university's culture.
It's transparently clear to anyone who wants to pay attention that there's no commitment to change, because the president of the university couldn't stop himself from having his own affair that was against their written rules. I mean, it is a culture of duplicity.
Robert Stone and Keith Morey both graduated from U of M in the 70s and 80s. Both say university officials did nothing when they came forward accusing Dr. Anderson of sexual assault.
We go to the extreme example of a Dr. Anderson, which is very, very different than what ex-President Schlissel is being accused of. But they're sort of along the same continuum of what happens when people are made untouchable. And that's part of the culture that has to change.
Without a public vote and behind closed doors, Schlissel was fired by the Board of Regents.
I have to have confidence that that the regents are going to also be looking at their role in all of this and looking at how they need to be doing things differently in the future.
They're hoping the new president will have the desire and the support to bring about real change.
If this continues, a degree from the University of Michigan is just going to be an embarrassment. And it's going to take a real change in attitude among the Board of Regents to turn this around.
There needs to be a Truth and Reconciliation Committee to really, first of all, look at what's been going on there. Let's get this out in the open, really know what we're dealing with, take the hard knocks, and then move forward together.
In Ann Arbor, I'm Priya Mann, Local 4.
Well, in an emailed response, the university says, in part, quote, "We have added new policies that prohibit teacher-learner romantic relationships, that prohibit supervisor-supervisee relationships, and strengthened our policy against any type of retaliation," end quote.